Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Logocentric. My name is Daxton Page, and today we are going to be talking about science and spirituality and how they could potentially coexist, or maybe why they're so opposed to each other. Coming right up. So I wanted to cover these topics today because I was thinking about a few stories that I had from my life, and I was recently watching a discussion between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, particularly their third discussion they had in Dublin, Ireland. I highly recommend you check out that discussion. So I wanted to go ahead and jump into this. So I remember growing up, because I'm from Oklahoma, which is a very southern Bible Belt, state. I grew up very Christian, right? Or at least under Christian practices, specifically Southern Baptist. And that was just sort of what I grew up with. And my family was very devout, and they did not take to skepticism or questioning very well. But that's okay. I totally understand that. But in the same respect, I didn't necessarily believe everything that was taught to me, understandably, and I had questions, and when nobody had answers to those questions, I grew more skeptical and a little bit more agnostic. But for a period of time, I was pretty devoutly atheist, in a sense, because I was sort of resentful for the fact of being taught certain things and then not having those principles verified in any meaningful way. And I felt like I just was sort of indoctrinated. And I thought there was good stories and good morals in the stories, but I felt the way that everything was being approached was just very pathological. And so I didn't want any part of it as a young teenager. And so as I grew more skeptical and basically more atheist and secular, I started to have more caricatured arguments against religion. And I noticed these arguments sort of permeating in the community of people who were doing sort of a similar thing or were going through a similar thing that I was going through, which was, kind of coming out of a religious phase in their life and into a more not only secular but skeptical phase in their life. So what happened from that point? So I was recently, and by recently I'm going to go ahead and clarify that, I mean in the grand scheme of things, like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, I started discovering, a better argument for religious texts. And so, because I explored the texts of not only Christianity, but of, the Vedas of Hindu, and, I haven't got to the Quran, but I studied a little bit of the Torah and the Bible. I was trying to figure out for myself, where did I fall spiritually? Because I did not feel that there was no such thing as God or the idea of God. I just didn't agree with the particular conception that was being forced upon me in my particular culture in the Bible Belt, right? So I felt their conception was wrong, but that there wasn't, that was a terrible grammar sentence. There wasn't nothing. No, there wasn't anything that signified to me that there was no God, but just the conception that I was being taught in like Bible school and Bible studies. That conception to me didn't seem to match up with what I was feeling and with reality as I saw it, at the time. So I grow older, I grow more skeptical. I come eventually back to respect religious traditions and understand them, with a little bit more respect. And so what happens is I start to notice bad arguments against religion easier. And so I'm, looking through my social media and I'm scrolling through my feed and I see arguments against, let's take for instance Noah's Ark. It's a very popular whipping boy for atheists and religious stories and stuff like that. So the whole thing with Noah's Ark is I'll just go straight to the criticisms instead of going through the story, because I'm sure you've probably heard the story. Either way, essentially people start saying things like, well, if Noah's Ark was true, where did he get all the wood, for the boat? And he was so old, how did he build it in such a short period of time? How did he get 2 of every animal? How did all the animals not eat each other? Like, they pick the story apart in that sort of manner. But in my opinion, that's sort of it's a really bad way to look at the story, because first of all, we're halfway through the story. Because Noah's Ark is actually sort of a halfway point after what's called like the flood story. It's a part of the flood story. So if you don't know the story of the flood, the story of Noah's Ark kind of doesn't make any sense. And so if you understand the moral of the flood story, you understand the moral of Noah's Ark better. But if you just look at Noah's Ark and you don't look at any of the context around it, you just try to observe it as a scientific statement inside of a text, it's not going to read well, right? But these aren't literal, empirical, scientific truths. And by that I mean truths that would be validated through the scientific method, so to speak. But they were quote-unquote metaphorical truths, to coin a term from Brett Weinstein. So as I got older, I was able to recognize these very low-resolution arguments against religious stories, and so that gave me an inclination to start to pursue, well, what is the true meaning of these stories, and is there anything of value, and can I just leave these stories behind? And the more I dug, the more value I found. And so I started to eventually not necessarily identify myself as Christian, because I wouldn't say, again, that's the religion I left, and I don't particularly like the way that the structure of Christian churches operate, because I actually know a few people, I won't name names, one's very close to me, and he stated that he had a family member, he came from a family of like preachers and pastors and stuff like that, so his family was in deep, right? And so what happened was his father, who was going to be a preacher and all this kind of stuff, he started studying the Bible, and he started studying every single word and tried to understand what these phrases meant, what was the context, what was the true meaning. He would go look up like original Hebrew versions of the Bible and translate those to the original meanings and try to, he was a truth seeker. And eventually he discovered that the God that he believed in through his studies and discovery almost bared no resemblance to the God that was being preached by his family. And when he tried to bring up these sort of like, guys, we're teaching the wrong thing. What we're actually teaching in certain segments is the opposite of the way it was originally written and translated. So we're actually preaching the wrong thing here. People didn't want to hear it because it was either A, too complex, or they thought someone was just trying to undermine the church. And so there's a sort of parasitic atmosphere inside of churches that needs fixing, especially in this part of the country, right? What happens is these stories are trying to communicate truths that have been discovered and articulated throughout time, through mostly trial and error, and thousands, if not millions, if not billions of years of learned wisdom accumulated. Now, people say, how are you going into the billions? I'm referring now to like a sort of evolutionary time scale, right? If there's certain modes of being that existed for a species that was proto-human, there were certain things that it needed to do to evolve to be, proto-human and then eventually to a human, right? And so there's wisdom accumulated in that time span that continues to accrue and accrue and accrue and accrue. Now, some of the wisdom is what you might say is, it's not completely timeless, but it's pretty damn close. And then you have other truths that are pretty disposable and very dated. Obviously, you could tell that truth was for this time period. And I'll give you an example that Brett Weinstein gives on the Joe Rogan Experience that I saw one time. He says that, God hates filth. What is filth? Filth is shit. Sorry for the explicit language. But basically, the reason you should keep filth, aka feces, aka shit, away from you is because God doesn't like it. Now, that doesn't really rationally make any sense, but if you look at it from the perspective of germ theory, it's almost as if people were acting out germ theory using myth before they even had an inclination of what germ theory was. And the very fact they acted that myth out actually allowed them to eventually accrue enough knowledge to understand the correlation between the knowledge of don't be around shit, because it was in this text, and now we have a scientific backing for what was in this religious text. But the religious text itself now is a little bit outdated because now we know. Now we know why they were saying God hates filth, right? Because it led to all sorts of diseases, right? Because you're around bacteria from shit and all that kind of stuff. So it's just a little example of how we used a myth that didn't have any sort of rational bearing to actually discover rationally pragmatic scientific knowledge that helped us evolve and live longer and not die so much from diseases, right? And so that was one way that I saw that, wow, a myth could actually be very powerful, even if there's no empirical basis for it. Now, that does not mean, I want to make a big disclaimer here, that does not mean that you should just leap into the arms of irrationality into myth, because, basically I'm saying you shouldn't just abandon rationality altogether. That would be a very bad game plan, because rationality is sort of this interplay between the worlds of facts and values, right? And so reason and rationality is the narrowing, I've talked about this a little bit before, is the narrowing of facts and values to actions that you can actually act out in the world, right? And so what do I mean by that? So there's the example of, you have facts, which you could roughly equate to objective truths about an existing reality that is independent of consciousness perceiving that reality. And then you have values, which is how a being inside of that objective reality acts out, taking in as many facts as they can observe into consideration. And so essentially what we're doing with values is we're taking a near infinite number of facts, pieces of information about the world, and we're narrowing them to a value that we could act out in the world, because we need some sort of narrowing mechanism, or else we're just overwhelmed with complexity of just all the facts and no way to act within the facts, right? So you have to have an action that, or I guess you should say, you have to have a value that guides your action. Essentially, for me to look at this camera, my brain is telling me that it's more important to look here than to look at my cup, which helps me if I get dry mouth, or if, I start to, choke or something like that, right? My eye is viewing things very tool-like. I'm viewing the microphone as something to speak into, right? And it doesn't matter that there's other microphones that look different than this one. I would react to them the same way, and I would visually view them as the same thing, because I could do the same action through them, right? So your vision is very tool-like. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that when you're operating in the world, you're viewing the facts as they are, right? You're viewing the facts around you, as I'm trying to observe in my room, right? I'm looking at the greenness of my cup, the blackness of the surface that this is sitting on, my face, and all the information, the colors, the movement. All of those facts are being entered into my brain right now, but without a particular value structure as to how to narrow those things, I'm just drowning in sort of nihilistic chaos. But I need a mode of being to act out in the world as to not be essentially overwhelmed by complexity and suffering, but also as a way to, this is where we could go into evolution, advance my genes, and advance my values. But here's the thing, where do my values come from? Well, some of my values come from my experiences that I've accrued in the world and made value judgments based off those experiences. But that and the culture that I live in has provided a sort of set of values from birth, right? And so I think it's almost part of the same process. Is you're born into a culture that has a certain set of values, and it's your job as you're a new life inside of that culture to observe it and see where it needs updating and where it's valuable, and preserve it, right? And I think one of the things that's happening with atheism is we're not respecting, and we're not preserving the cultures, or I should say the aspects of our culture that have allowed us to evolve this far into time in the first place, right? And so there are certain structures, like hierarchies, that do exist that have actually served as a way for us to aim up and actually achieve things in the world. Technological achievements, moral achievements, right? Like the abolition of slavery, right? We need to have this sort of progress, this ideal that we're looking up to that narrows what we could do to what we should do, right? And that's essentially what Christ acts as in the Christian faith. And so that's constantly critiqued. But all the other fundamental stories that are, put forth in the Bible, whether there be Old Testament or New Testament, are critiqued at this low resolution level that I discussed earlier with Noah's Ark, right? And so my issue became, as I got older, I started to respect those cheap arguments less and less, because I started to say, well, these things actually have value, and I'm not even sure you know that exists. You're just acting as if you know the truth and nobody else knows it, and everyone else is just stupid for believing these myths. But I don't agree with that. I refuse to view people who adhere to these mythological stories as stupid, because these myths would not have succeeded in profligating their ideals and morals for no reason. Now, I don't want to fall prey to the naturalistic fallacy, which is to say that because it came from evolution, therefore it is good, right? So I don't want to fall prey to that fallacy. So again, there are truths inside of the Bible that come from the stories, the morals of those stories, that are dated, right? So that part of the Bible, we need to figure out a way to essentially, we need an updating of the Bible. Now, that's dangerous territory, because you're updating a fundamental text that has literally influenced almost everything inside of that culture, from art, music, literature, all those perspectives, all those fields have been insanely influenced by things like the Bible. Now, I mentioned things like hierarchies, and I'm going to say something that's sort of, again, controversial, I think, is if we're going to accept the idea that a hierarchy exists, and that there's things like hierarchies of hierarchies. This is where we get the idea of King of Kings, which is an idea that was articulated most prominently in the Christian faith. Not to say that it solely came from that articulation, but most prominently that I've seen from my studies. If you have something else, please let me know. So what's happening is that these stories, just to kind of cut to the chase, these stories are being undercut at a low resolution level, right? They're being attacked with arguments that sound, snide and, oh, we got you. Here was the gotcha moment. It's almost like the rhetorical equivalent of the videos you see on YouTube of like Ben Shapiro gets destroyed by, whoever. And so like those type of things, it's almost like that's the rhetorical equivalent of that type of video, if you know what I'm saying. So what we need to do is, if we're going to criticize these texts, we need to have a foundational understanding of what these texts mean. Now, here's the thing. People like Jacques Derrida, and I'm reading his book of grammatology right now, or however you say it, grammatology, I think that's how you say that. I'm reading his book right now, and he is what I would think of as one of the most intelligent critics of the West and its fundamental axioms, right? Now, that doesn't mean I think he's right. I actually think he's wrong in most respects, but he's going after the idea of the logos. Now, this is actually a part of the reason that I named this channel Logocentric, is actually that term logocentrism was popularized by Jacques Derrida because he was using it to describe the West. He actually used foul logocentrism, because we were male privileging, reason privileging culture, right? That's what we were. Or hopefully we still are, I would, not necessarily with the male, but mostly the reason, right? Because male and female, I don't think necessarily the foul is male as in my biology male. I mean that in the sense of what we consider as masculinity, or the patriarchy, right? Now, the patriarchy is described as a negative thing, but what I want to break down is that a patriarchy can have two aspects. You can have the wise king and the tyrannical father, right? These are sort of Jungian archetypal perspectives on the patriarchy, right? So what that means is the feminists that you hear talking about the patriarchy, and they're always talking about how negative it is, they're talking about the tyrannical father archetype. And they're obsessed by that. But the thing is, they refuse or can't see the wise king archetype that also exists within the patriarchy, so to speak. And so I am all for putting prime focus culturally on the idea of reason. I think that I don't think there's anything wrong with it. That's why my channel is not foul logocentric. It's logocentric, right? So the whole male privilege thing, I don't necessarily think that we should just by default be male privileged, because I think there's a lot of wisdom that we don't take into account that we get from women, right? Or just femininity in general, right? Like when I'm talking about masculinity and femininity, I'm talking about them symbolically, right? And what their typical, you might even describe it as like their gender roles, what it means to be man, what it means to be woman, right? I'm not necessarily saying biologically, you with this particular biological set of units that can produce these results, I'm not necessarily referring to that. But anyway, let's get back on track a little bit. So Jacques Derrida was a huge critic of the idea of the logos. Now, what is the logos? This is a big thing, and I'm not even probably going to be able to describe it perfectly. So again, I'm not describing this 100% perfectly. The logos is the idea that God was the Word, right? And so order from truthful speech was the Word of God, right? That God was that thing that created order out of truthful speech, and that speech, that word was the logos, right? John 1:1 is a great Bible verse you can read that really kind of outlines this idea of Christ being the logos and God being the logos, but God being the word. When you hear that sort of thing now, what Jacques Derrida realized is that if he wanted to undermine Western culture, he would attack the word, not just words in general, which he certainly did. And he wanted to deconstruct language, because within the word, within logos, he wanted to dismantle that, because that was the Western tradition that had held up liberal democracy. Because, by the way, I'm not implanting motives for Derrida. People may accuse me of that. It's very well known that he was a prominent Marxist all through his career, even though he wasn't very outspoken about it till the latter years of his career. But he did mention that his works were all inspired in a spirit of Marxism, right? He said that deconstruction was created in the spirit of a sort of Marxism. And so the spirit of Marxism, right? So attack the West and to, attack categories in general. So what he thought, at least from my studies of what I've got from of grammatology, is that the idea that we strived for logic through dialogue was originally done in the pursuit of the understanding of the Word of God, aka truth. And so therefore, all dialogue is all just a power structure to serve the logos over everything else. And so that's what Jacques Derrida's fundamental critique is. And it's a very deep critique. It's very complicated. And again, I'm not doing it 100% justice. I would recommend you read the books for yourselves. See what he says. Even though he's very obscure, almost on purpose it feels like, which, hey, dick move, Derrida. But if you understand what he's saying, it makes perfect sense what he's critiquing and why he's critiquing it from his perspective, right? And so he wanted to use the tools within language to destroy language. So he wanted to destroy the word, right? And specifically the logocentric side of the word. And all he believed existed were things like identity, right? And expression, right? And he thought that we were too fixated on things like presence, as he would say it, right? And so these terms are very densely packed with information. So if some of these are a little bit strange to you, I would recommend just Googling them and take Wikipedia with a big ass grain of salt, but go Wikipedia them and try to learn these terms. It helps provide a little bit of perspective when you go to read Jacques Derrida. It makes them a little bit more readable. So I'm going to kind of stop there. I think there's a lot of stuff that we could continue to go into, but I think when it comes back down to it, to wrap things up, you have people like Derrida, who were insanely intelligent, who actually studied the great works of our time. He studied the Western canon. Now, however, he studied the Western canon with a very particular goal in mind, right? And that was deconstructionism, right? Which is, by the way, that's the opposite of scientific thinking. Scientific thinking is I have an idea, and I'm going to see how all those ways are wrong, how all those ideas and those ways of thinking that I have are wrong. And Derrida went into it with the opposite mindset. He had an idea he wanted to confirm, so he tried to look for interpretations so that he could dismantle the credibility of the canon and say that, it's all nothing but wordplay, and, you're just privileging one interpretation over the other just to serve arbitrary power, games and all this sorts of stuff, right? So it's good to understand Derrida's critique because it's one of the most fundamental critiques I've run into, right? Other than like Immanuel Kant, which we have a video about, so I'd click the card here if you're interested in that video. Other than Kant, or maybe even Rousseau, which, by the way, Rousseau is mentioned in Of Grammatology. There's a whole chapter that's called The Age of Rousseau. So I would recommend checking that out so that you can basically learn the most articulated version of the skeptical side of this argument. And then what I would recommend you read as a counterbalance to that would be something like Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson, or maybe something like The History, I believe it's called The History of the Unconscious, the History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann. I believe that's the correct title of that. Or I recommend you read any Carl Jung books like Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, Symbols of Transformation, things of that nature. So yeah, read these books as sort of a good informational, diet to have in this conversation when it comes to religion and science, because I think what you're gonna discover is that your conceptions previously, if you haven't already gone down this avenue of the idea of God and the idea of these skeptical arguments, they're going to become more articulated and more refined. And so I definitely recommend taking that journey and learning these perspectives, even if you disagree with them, because I deeply disagree with Jacques Derrida, but I understood his perspective way more once I actually read his words, from the horse's mouth. That's where I want to get my knowledge. That was one of the main reasons that I left college. And one, because I thought it was a scam and it was so much money and I don't think it pertained to my particular career choices. So I was like, this is a little pointless, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave. But I also wanted the ideas of the greatest thinkers of all time. I wanted that in my own personal library, right? And so that's when I started to accumulate the books that you see behind me. And I have students that I work with, and I try to let them know that, like, don't think that you just have to go to college to get knowledge, right? So it's one of those things that you can get education by yourself, and you can learn about some of the deepest truths and debates of our time. And I think this is one of them, and it's been sort of it's been caricatured by really bad arguments on the atheist side of it. Now, then again, there have been really terrible arguments on the Christian side of it too. Like we have things like creationism, where they tried to shoehorn empirical science into a non-scientific book, right? And so I don't want to point all the blame at atheists, because there are plenty of Christians making terrible arguments in defense of their own religion, which was one of the things that I was talking about earlier, that there are systems of disseminating knowledge and teachings in the Christian faith, in the organizations of churches, that is really flawed. And so it's not just atheists putting crappy arguments forward against religion. It's also religion putting crappy arguments in defense of their own religion, right? And so we need to sort of be able to look past these things. We need to be able to see above the surface and see that really both these people are arguing, this is a false choice that we're being presented, that it has to be this argument, that, all these stories, they're definitely not empirical truths. Look at that. There's no way Noah could have done X, Y, and Z. It's like, yes, we obviously understand that. That is not the purpose of a text. Let me ask you a question, and I don't want to try to equate the Bible with something like Harry Potter. But when Harry Potter, shoots a spell out of his wand, are you going to sit there and nitpick and say, well, there's no physical? Are you going to tell me that a kid with glasses and a scar on his head shot magic out of a stick? No one would make that argument. They'd be like, what? It's a story. You're supposed to learn from the story. That's the kind of crappy argument we're seeing from atheists. And then the crappy argument we're seeing from the religious side is we're saying, no, this is literally true. This is literally true. Harry Potter literally shot magic out of his hands. It's like, guys, we're missing the point. Like, you guys are arguing something that's not even the point. So this is what I want to try to attempt to do with the video like this, is to get the conversation steered potentially in the right direction. steered potentially in the right direction, right? So what do you guys think about this? Have you had any experience of dealing with really crappy arguments from atheists or Christians or any religious people in general? Have you had experiences like that? What were your experiences like? Please let me know. Let's get a conversation going. I want to see what y'all's perspective is on this, and I want to hear your thoughts. So what do you think is a better argument? Do the skeptics have your vote, or do the more pragmatic religious people have your vote? Let me know in the comments. Also, like and share this video if you really enjoyed it. Hit the notification bell to be notified when videos just like this drop. Also, go over and join us at ThinkSpot and locals.com. There we're having a great sort of community vibe where we're having conversations that we can't have on YouTube, Twitter, the sort of big tech platforms. And I will see you guys on the next episode. I'm Logocentric. Thank you for watching.